Hello, welcome to my long-awaited book review for Kamala Harris's 107 Days. I say long-awaited, I've awaited it a long time. I actually read the book months ago, and I finished writing the review weeks ago. I posted it on Twitter. But it's taken me a really long time to record the video for the book review. And the reason is every time I started to record the video, I started to just read the article as I wrote it. And I heard this little voice in the back of my head saying, I'm bored reading this. Who's going to want to watch it? And whenever I heard that voice, my motivation to record the video just drained away. So rather than just read to you my book review, I'm just going to try to talk you through the main ideas of it. And if you're interested in reading it, it's really good. It's really interesting. You should. I know I said it bored me, but you'll love it. Anyway, it's on Twitter. So you can go see that post on Twitter if you want to just read the text of it. But I'm just going to try to talk you through it. Okay, let's get started. I was hoping to get two things out of this book. First, I wanted to know how Harris lost. Now, don't get me wrong, the election was challenging. People hated Joe Biden. There was a ton of inflation. There was the COVID lockdowns that everyone was still angry about. People felt like their economic conditions were better back under Trump's first term than under Biden. And so people just had a lot of anger and animosity at Biden, justified or not. So that was a bad spot to be in. And then furthermore, when Harris became the nominee, she only had 107 days to run her campaign. So she didn't have as much time as a nominee normally would. And she didn't go through a primary process. So she wasn't selected the way that a nominee normally would be. So this wasn't the easiest election in the world. But on the other hand, Trump had lost his previous election. He had denied losing. He insists to this day that he actually won against Joe Biden. Trump tried and failed to overturn the election in ways that are legal and not so legal. Trump is an old, corrupt, serial liar plagued by countless scandals and relentless gaffes. So it seems like it should have been possible to beat him. And I wanted to know, what was Harris's strategy? What was she thinking? What decisions did she make and why? And with the benefit of hindsight, what was a mistake and what worked well? Unfortunately, Harris doesn't really analyze her decisions like that. She doesn't go back and think things through or offer trade-offs or consider different strategies. And so I was disappointed. Mainly the book is just a narrative retelling of what the campaign was like for her. And in Harris's own telling, she actually doesn't make that many decisions. And the decisions that she does make, they don't really matter. For example, she picks Tim Walz to be her vice presidential candidate, even though Walz tells her on their first meeting that he's bad at debating. And later, when Walz loses, according to Harris, or does badly, according to Harris, a debate with J.D. Vance, Harris just says that, well, the vice presidential debate doesn't really matter. It had negligible effect on our polling. And I think of that as an example where she makes a decision with some trade-off. She's selecting a vice presidential candidate who's bad at debate, and then it turns out that, well, the VP debates don't really matter. So there's not a lot of working through the trade-offs in different decisions. And when she does make a decision, she'll just tell you that it doesn't matter. Another example is when she chooses not to go on Joe Rogan's podcast. She says that, well, one podcast isn't going to determine the election, and that's true. But the election is made up of decisions like who's going to be your VP, or VP debates, or are you going on giant podcasts? And the election is made up of these decisions, and when Harris seems to make them incorrectly, she'll just say, well, it doesn't really matter. And I found that off-putting. I think it does matter. Maybe any one decision is not going to decide the election, but cumulatively, they do. That is the election. Harris also doesn't really take responsibility. An example of this is she decides to campaign with Liz Cheney. And I thought that was odd at the time. The right wing doesn't like Liz Cheney because she didn't support Trump, and Trump endorsed her primary challenger, and Liz Cheney lost her congressional seat by a huge margin. The left wing doesn't support Liz Cheney because Liz Cheney is a conservative Republican named Cheney. So right wing doesn't like Liz Cheney, left wing doesn't like Liz Cheney. Harris is campaigning with Liz Cheney. That seemed like an odd choice to me. But what Harris says about it is just that the media made too much of it. And I don't understand that at all. If it was a good decision to campaign with Liz Cheney, you would want the media to focus on it. You've made a good campaigning decision, it's getting a lot of media attention. On the other hand, if it was a bad decision, then you wouldn't want the media to focus on it. But then it seems to me like you should say, I made a bad decision here. This was a mistake because of X, Y, Z. Here's what I should have done differently. I shouldn't have campaigned with Liz Cheney, and so on. So there's just not a lot of analysis or accountability or reflection in my view. Harris makes some decisions. The bad decisions she makes, they don't really matter, and bad things that happen, those are other people's fault. I think that's kind of a consistent theme through the book, and we'll explore that more as we go on. The second thing I wanted out of the book was to know just how old is Joe Biden? And I don't mean that in a quantitative sense. I could Google his age. What I want to know is how old is he in a pejorative sense? Like, is he mentally declining? Is he slow? Is he unsure or senile or something? Harris has a behind the scenes view. She's working closely with Biden. And so I wanted to understand, to what extent is Biden's age a drawback for the president? And Harris doesn't really explore that. She doesn't dig into it. There are parts of the book where she acknowledges that Biden has lost a step, or that he's old if he's tired, or that he's not as young as he used to be, or that a deposition might exhaust him or something. And it just left me wondering, isn't that pretty important for the presidency? Shouldn't the president be able to do a deposition or be mentally sharp in the evening or late afternoon? Don't we need the president to have that kind of youthfulness or cognitive ability? That's actually not just a rhetorical question. I'm actually curious about that because Harris supported Biden. And yet Harris also knew that Biden had lost a step. In other words, Harris implicitly thinks that there are more important things than the president's cognitive fitness, that the president actually doesn't have to be mentally sharp. That's not the most important thing in the world. And I find that a really interesting subject, and I wish that Harris would have explored it more and explained it to the reader, why maybe it wasn't so important that Biden was cognitively declining. I'd have loved to learn about that. I think that's a kind of provocative thesis that I would have loved to explore, but Harris doesn't really address that either. She, in a few glancing references, she'll acknowledge that Biden was old and had lost a step, but she doesn't really dwell on that. So that's the high level. Now let's get into the details. I've got 10 separate sections that we can explore. So that's my introduction. Now let's get into the details. I've got 10 separate chapters that go into 10 of the biggest reasons that stuck out to me as why Harris lost. So I don't think Harris really gave us the why she lost explanation in her own words. This is my attempt to reconstruct why she lost from the text of her book. I wish I could explore the Biden's age thing, but there just wasn't enough of that in the book for me to try that. So the following 10 chapters are why Harris lost, according to me, according to her. Chapter 1, Joe Rogan. There's this old proverb in the game of Go that says, the enemy's key point is yours too. And what it means is, if the enemy has to move somewhere to win, you should move there first. You should stop them from moving there somehow. Because if it's critical to your enemy, it's critical to you too. If they're going to win, you get the idea. And this proverb is what I was thinking about when I was reading the chapter about why Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan. By the time of the election, Trump's appearance on the Rogan podcast had 50 million views on YouTube alone, to say nothing of how many views it might have had on Spotify or Apple Podcast or whatever other podcast apps there are out there, not to mention all the clips all across every social media platform. It had a ton of views. For context, the presidential debate between Trump and Harris had around 67 million views, according to Nielsen ratings, plus another 14 on YouTube, and who knows how many more on other platforms or media channels talking about it. I'm giving you these numbers to give you a rough idea that the Joe Rogan podcast, it's smaller than the presidential debate, but not by that much. It's in the same ballpark. And so just like I think it would have been crazy for Harris to refuse to do the presidential debate, to give Trump an outlet where he got to talk to tens of millions of people for hours as long as he wanted, to give him the presidential debate to go on by himself. I think it's crazy that Harris let Trump have the Joe Rogan podcast uncontested. It's like, that's a key point. It should have been Harris's key point too. Harris should have done something to contest it or to conflict with it or mitigate it. She should have gone on Joe Rogan to give her side of the story. Just looking at number of views understates the importance, because Rogan's audience is mainly young men, and young men mainly voted against Harris. And so taking a vote away from your opponent is like convincing two people to vote for you. -1 vote for Trump, +1 vote for Harris. That's a swing of 2 votes. So Harris had this opportunity to talk to tens of millions of people who, most of whom weren't going to vote for her anyway. She could have been stealing a huge number of votes from Trump, and that would have been really important. And again, she just didn't do it. And even in her own telling, she's choosing not to do it. And I found that really frustrating and bad. When she talks about why she didn't do it, she says it was a scheduling issue, basically. She wanted to do the podcast on October 25th, but Joe Rogan wasn't available. Again, in her own telling, Rogan offers her at least 3 other times. Rogan says, I can do it late, like around midnight on the 25th, or I could do it on the 24th, or I could do it on the 27th. So Rogan's giving her 3 other choices, and she refuses all of those other choices. Still, even though most of my team thought doing the interview at all was a gamble and others bluntly argued it was a bad idea, I really wanted to do it. One podcast was not going to win or lose the election, but Rogan's audience was young and male. I wanted to reach those guys who might not otherwise hear from me. Good idea. They had a rally in Houston on October 25, so on October 18, Harris's team called Rogan's people, and they said they could do the interview on October 25. Word came back. It's a personal day for Joe. He's not available. If you'd just called the day before, we could have done it. How about the following day? So Rogan's team is offering her the following day. They could do it at 8:30 a.m. on the 26th. But no, Harris has commitments as well, and it wasn't feasible to get from Houston to Austin by 8:30 a.m. Don't you have a plane? Couldn't you go from Houston to Austin late at night? To be totally transparent, which sadly they were not, they offered us times on the 24th or the 27th or sometime after the rally on the 25th. And remember, they also offered the next day, 26th, 8:30 a.m., or sometime after the rally on the 25th, which was set to conclude at 10 p.m. It wasn't realistic to go from Houston to Austin and do a podcast at midnight. But you could go from Houston to Austin at 10 p.m., and then do it in the morning in Austin, right? Nor was I about to hang around an extra day in Texas a week out from the election. I believe they knew that when they offered those times. What? She asks for the 25th and they say, no, we can do the 24th, the 26th, or the 27th. And she thinks they know she can't do any of those other times. They give her many other times, every other date except the date which they were interviewing Trump, where they had a prior commitment. The plain truth, I wanted to go on Joe Rogan's podcast on October 25. He chose Trump instead. He had already arranged it with Trump. What was she doing instead of going on Joe Rogan? Well, on October 27th, Harris was doing a campaign event in West Philadelphia. She describes her audience as mainly Black and Latino voters. And I can't help but notice that Black and Latino voters already voted overwhelmingly for Harris. So again, to me, it seems like she's trading a huge audience of people that aren't currently voting for her for a small audience of people who are currently voting for her. And that just seems like a bad strategic decision. In other words, what she actually did on October 27th seems way less important than doing the podcast. And in the evening of October 24th, she was doing a campaign rally in Georgia. Couldn't she have done the Joe Rogan podcast in the morning and then fly to Georgia to do her campaign rally there, or maybe miss one campaign rally. She had dozens of campaign rallies, and there's just not an obvious opportunity like the Joe Rogan podcast that she could do instead. So she's giving up this one-of-a-kind opportunity to reach tens of millions of people who currently are not voting for her in exchange for talking to people who already support her, who are going to her campaign rallies in Georgia or in Philadelphia. It seems like a bad choice, and she doesn't really explain that. If anything, she minimizes the decision not to go on Joe Rogan, saying the election isn't going to be decided by a single podcast. And that's true. That one podcast wouldn't decide the election. But the election is made up of things like the decision to go on giant podcasts or to talk to huge audiences who disagree with you or not. And the Joe Rogan podcast, I think, is one of those decisions. And if any podcast appearance were going to move the needle on an election, I think the Rogan podcast is one. I don't accept Harris's explanation that scheduling was the issue, why she couldn't go on the Joe Rogan podcast. It would be like if I was dying of a medical problem and my surgeon said, well, I can't see you on the 25th, but I could see you on the 27th or the 24th. And I said, no, those times don't really work for me. I actually have a prior commitment on the 27th. It wouldn't make sense as an explanation to the surgeon. Hey, this is super important that you get this life-saving surgery. Or, hey, it's super important that you appear in front of tens of millions of people who disagree with you so you can win their votes. That's super critical to the mission of the election. It doesn't make sense that you would turn that away because of some minor scheduling issue. Actually, I've got a campaign event. I'm doing dozens of them or hundreds of them. I got to stick to this one. It doesn't make sense that you would make that scheduling choice, is the point I'm trying to get at. So why didn't Harris do the Joe Rogan podcast? Well, I think we get an explanation if we look at another YouTube channel that Harris actually did go on, Dr. Mike. In the book, Harris says that she was ambushed by this interview.
We're reading from the book. Kirsten informed me that Jod had scheduled a last-minute interview with Dr. Mike, a podcaster. Don't worry, Kirsten said. Won't take long. It's just a brief thing on the RFK appointment. The campaign in Wilmington tended to choose my interviews on various subjects by asking, who has the biggest audience, the widest reach? Joe Rogan, maybe? Just a thought. But it was up to my team, who I knew insisted on being well prepared, to inquire into the style of the show, the nature of the interviews the host did, the areas of likely questioning. She's preemptively blaming her team. Then they'd give me a briefing sheet so I could knock it out of the park. But that hadn't happened this time. It's her team's fault. They ushered me into a room where the Zoom was set up on a laptop. Dr. Mike was all ready to go. He launched into his introduction. Welcome to the Checkup Podcast, where today I have the pleasure of speaking to Vice President Kamala Harris. I was curious to know her plans surrounding healthcare costs, anti-science rhetoric, barriers to primary care, women's health, and the risks children face while eating overly processed foods for lunch. That was Dr. Mike introducing Harris to his podcast. WTF, Harris thinks. This is clearly not a brief thing on RFK. Dr. Mike was deeply knowledgeable, warmed up on all these issues, and raring to go, as I would have been had I not just been ambushed by an unscheduled, in-depth interview with no notice at the end of a 19-hour day. I slid a scribbled note across the table. Where's my briefing? The staff looked at each other. They had nothing. When Dr. Mike asked, are you getting your 7 to 9 hours of sleep these days? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At the end of the interview, I sent the junior staffers out, leaving just Kirsten, Brian, Ike, and Sheila.
And when I read that part of the book, I immediately had this kind of dark glee, like, haha, it'll be funny to see Harris get ambushed in this interview and be totally out of her depth. And I ran to my computer and pulled up the interview on YouTube to watch it. And when I watched it, I think a lot of things made sense to me, which is when I watched it, it did not seem like an ambush at all. I could not tell that Harris was unprepared or out of her depth, and it didn't seem like a hard interview at all. Dr. Mike asks Harris 7 questions, and that includes, is she getting enough sleep? And it's over 15 or 20 minutes. It's actually not an in-depth interview at all. Dr. Mike doesn't ask follow-up questions. He doesn't push back. He doesn't debate with her. And still, even in retrospect, Harris thinks that was a tough, challenging, in-depth interview ambush that she was unprepared for. That's how she describes it in her book in retrospect. I could understand if she thought maybe it'll be that way going into it, but the interview is just absolutely not like that at all. It's a very easy, cookie-cutter interview without any challenging questions. And it's this idea that Harris feels unprepared for it. She feels like she needed a briefing sheet from her staff in order to be able to do an interview like this. It's that idea that I think unlocks why she didn't go on the Joe Rogan podcast. Because on the Joe Rogan podcast, where it's a 2 or 3 hour conversation and Joe Rogan might push back on you, that's something extremely different that would be really hard to prepare for with a briefing sheet. And I think RFK specifically is kind of revealing here. Dr. Mike asks Harris, "Are you concerned about RFK?" And Harris basically says, "Yes, I am." But imagine how that same conversation would go on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think Joe Rogan is pretty sympathetic to RFK's point of view. So Joe Rogan might say, "Are you concerned about RFK? Why?" Or "You've called RFK a dangerous skeptic. Why?" And maybe Harris could answer that. But then Rogan isn't just going to go on to the next question. He's going to disagree or debate Harris or bring up the facts that he knows that he feels conflicts with her answer. And is Harris going to be able to have a debate like that in front of tens of millions of people live without being specifically prepared? Like RFK, I am not a medical expert, but I do think that RFK is a dangerous conspiracy theorist fraud who's anti-science and probably deliberately misrepresenting things. I formed that opinion after reading his book, Vax Unvax. And when I read it, I checked the citations that he was using to support his argument. And I found it was very often that the citations disagreed with him, or that he was completely inventing things and claiming they were in his cited sources when they weren't. And he also ignored substantial pieces of evidence against his argument and misrepresented evidence against his argument. So when I was reading that book, he came across to me as a deceptive, manipulative liar. And I've also followed his work against thimerosal, a mercury-based preservative in vaccines that RFK has thought for years was responsible for the rise in autism. And I found his work there, again, deceptive. RFK makes a lot of a Generation Zero message where he claims CDC researchers manipulated data. But if you go back and read the sources that RFK will link you to, you see nothing of the kind takes place. So in my experience with RFK, he's a hugely manipulative, deceptive liar. And the reason why I say he's probably deliberately misrepresenting things is because he will link you to good sources. It's just he misrepresents what the sources say. So he knows the medical literature or the sources well enough to find actual, credible, real sources that are on topic and are on point, but then he lies about what they say. So it seems like he knows what he's talking about and he's choosing to misrepresent it. Anyway, I don't want to go too far off onto RFK in my Kamala Harris book review. If you're interested, on my TikTok channel, I've posted several videos where I look at the citations in RFK's book and explain why I think he's misrepresenting them. Okay, recentering. Back to how Kamala Harris being on Dr. Mike shows she wouldn't have been good on Joe Rogan. That's the point I'm trying to make here. RFK doesn't just make things up completely from nothing. He's written 4 books about vaccines. He's referenced hundreds of medical papers, some of which he's described accurately. And the issue is, if Harris isn't familiar with the arguments that RFK makes, as understood and defended by Joe Rogan, then it's going to be very bad for her. It's going to be very challenging for her to debate the issue if she's not read up on the medical literature and if she's not able to defend her point from using the real data. Because Joe Rogan will be able to pull up sources through his assistant Jamie that validate the basic ideas that RFK is claiming. And unless you have dug into those sources and understand why and how RFK is manipulating them, you're going to be really unprepared to have a debate with someone who is familiar with the issue. And you might wind up looking very foolish. And like I said, RFK has written about hundreds of different papers over the years. And so it would be kind of implausible for Harris to prepare to defend any attack that Rogan might bring on vaccines or that Rogan might use to defend RFK. And Harris would have to be ready to talk about any way of defending or attacking RFK that Joe Rogan might go to. And there's just a huge number of possible ways to do that. The truth is probably something like Kamala Harris listens to medical experts who say RFK is dangerous anti-science conspiracy theorist or something. And Harris has accepted that opinion without digging too much into it. And I'm not maligning that. That's the correct thing to do. You can't know everything about every subject. You have to trust experts in some areas, and hopefully you've picked good experts. But I feel that it would be especially unconvincing for Harris to have strong opinions, like saying RFK is dangerous or a fraud, as she may have said in some circumstance. It would be dangerous to have those strong opinions and then be in a hostile interview where the interviewer is going to push back and be unable to defend those positions. And this is a structural weakness that Harris has that Trump didn't. We could imagine an alternate reality where Joe Rogan has the opposite opinion of RFK. And Trump goes on Rogan and Rogan says, "How could you have RFK as your candidate for Health and Human Services Secretary?" Well, Trump would just say, listen, a lot of people like Bobby, a lot of moms like Bobby, a lot of Americans like Bobby. People are really concerned about this issue. People are concerned about their kids. I'm concerned about their kids. We've got to have the best science. We've got to have the greatest healthcare. We think Bobby's going to do that. And Trump doesn't have to get into any of the particulars or any of the details. Trump doesn't have to make a scientific argument because he would just address the issue like that. And I'm concerned that Harris wouldn't be able to do the same kind of thing, or she wouldn't try to do the same kind of thing. And that makes going on the Rogan podcast really difficult for her. If she struggled to go on Dr. Mike's 15-minute, 7 questions, 0 pushback interview, I don't think it would have worked to go on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think this gets at a tension between what the president is and how the president appears. That is, obviously, the president can't be an expert on economics and foreign policy and the law and the Constitution and healthcare and vaccines and insurance and everything else. The president can't be an expert in all those things because there's just way too much to know about every one of those things. Instead, in reality, of course, the president has to rely on teams of experts to keep them informed. And yet, the president appears like, or tries to appear like, they are an expert in all of those things. So it would be very weird for us to see an interview on TV or on social media where someone asks the president, Mr. President, what about economics or healthcare or vaccines? And for the president to just say, well, I don't really know about that. That would be weird. And yet I think that's basically what would have to happen if you wanted to do an interview like that. So if I imagine Harris being on the Rogan podcast and getting pushback about RFK, the answer I hope she would be able to give and be received well is something like, well, look, people ask me about RFK. So I asked the medical expert in our campaign about RFK. I asked these team of doctors to evaluate RFK's work and get back to me. And they had very negative things to say about RFK. They thought his ideas were very bad and dangerous. And so then I noticed this tension between my medical experts, Dr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so. I noticed this tension between the experts and RFK. And so I decided to get a second opinion. And the second opinion, another group of outside experts unconnected to my campaign, they agreed with the first experts. And so then I asked an international group to see how maybe other countries are dealing with the same issues. And they agreed with my domestic experts. And so this kind of unanimity among medical experts and against RFK makes me think, on the one hand, we have a non-medical expert, lawyer, conspiracy theorist, and on the other hand, we have world-class experts and scientists, and I'm getting different opinions from each of those positions. I'm going to trust the experts on this issue. And I hope that Harris's reasoning is something like that. I hope Harris isn't trying to read medical literature herself and come to some opinion. I hope she is relying on multiple expert sources, and that's why she thinks RFK is dangerous. And in a way, it might be unsatisfying for a podcast experience, because Harris probably wouldn't be able to debate technical points. Oh, what about this paper? What about the dangers of thimerosal? Don't you know that Norway doesn't give their children hepatitis B at birth unconditionally? Harris probably wouldn't know how to deal with random specific technical issues like that. But she shouldn't know, right? That's not the president's job, or the would-be president's job, to drill into every policy proposal such that you could debate it with an informed adversary. That shouldn't be what the president is doing, because it would be impossible for the president to do that about every single topic the president would need to think about and make decisions about. Instead, the president should be something more like relying on experts. But maybe that's unsatisfying, or maybe that would be unsatisfying in a podcast. If Harris just said, I don't like RFK because Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, Professor So-and-so, they gave me this advice that RFK's policies are bad, I guess that's kind of the end of the conversation. You know, Rogan would say, oh, well, can you explain this? And Harris would say, nope. And for me personally, I would find that very compelling and refreshing. I would say, she's being honest. Good, she's listening to experts. Of course, that's what you should do. You should listen to a variety of experts, of credible experts with a good history, to make a difficult decision about something important, and not try to oh, actually, Joe, I read this myself. Actually, Joe, I'm ready to debate with you all the details of RFK's belief. That would really concern me if Harris spent her time and energy preparing to do that. And yet, I know it would make me happy. I would be pleased to see an answer like that. But I wonder if the general audience would or wouldn't receive that well. And I think that's kind of the challenge of Harris going on Rogan. She'd have to give answers that might be unsatisfying, or she'd have to figure out how to give answers that might be unsatisfying or might seem unsatisfying at first, in such a way as to convince Rogan's audience that she's actually doing the right and responsible thing. This is exactly the kind of tension or trade-off that I'm complaining isn't in the book. I don't think the real answer for why Harris didn't go on Rogan is scheduling. I think it's because of these structural differences in how hard it would be for Harris to go on Rogan compared to Trump. I think that has something to do with it. I think it's the difference between what the president actually is and how the president appears. And that difference goes back to the point I was asking in the introduction about Biden's age. It matters for the appearance of the president that the president is old and senile, but does it matter for what the president actually is? I don't know that it would have been better for Harris to go on Rogan. With the benefit of hindsight, I can say, I think she should have gone on Rogan, because I know she lost. And Rogan would have been a high variance thing. Maybe it would have worked really well. Maybe she would have been able to be persuasive and really win over a lot of Trump voters, in which case it might have made her more likely to win. Or maybe it would have gone really, really badly, in which case, it would have made her a lot less likely to win. That's what I mean by a high variance thing. Could have gone either way. But since we know Harris lost, benefit of hindsight, a high variance thing to really change the outcome is exactly what we should be looking for in retrospect. And that connects to another idea that I'm not really going to talk about much, which is polling is absent from Harris's book, except where she says that she doesn't really trust the polls. She says if she had listened to the polls, she never would have run for office for the first time. She beat the polls originally, I guess. But this perspective kind of lacks information from my point of view. In other words, if you knew you were losing in the polls, and you knew that meant I am likely to lose the election, then you would seek out high variance opportunities like the Rogan podcast in order to try to change the outcome of the election. And I don't think Harris did that. She didn't consider the trade-offs. She doesn't really explain honestly, in my view, why she didn't do the Joe Rogan podcast. I just don't accept the scheduling thing. I don't think she gave up tens of millions of views from people who aren't going to vote for her in exchange for a couple campaign rallies. And I'm disappointed that we didn't get a better analysis of the Rogan podcast and why she should or shouldn't have gone on to it. I wasn't convinced by her explanations, and I was left really unsatisfied, wanting a lot more. Chapter 2, Harris doesn't hate MAGA enough. Harris refers to Trump as a fascist, a racist, sexist fascist who's a danger for the country. And on the other hand, Harris is upset when Joe Biden seems to refer to Trump supporters as garbage. So there's this basic tension between Trump as a sexist, racist, fascist threat to America, and his supporters are basically fine, I guess. And I think it creates a situation where it seems like Harris doesn't really believe the things she's saying. How could you simultaneously think Trump fascist, Trump supporters good? Maybe all of his supporters are just confused little dummies. They don't know better. Harris has to educate them. Even that perception isn't good. And this basic tension, I think, is a struggle. It's a challenge for Harris. Makes me think of the criminal prosecutions of Donald Trump and the decision to do that or not. Think of this matrix. On one axis, we have prosecuting Trump risks politicizing the justice system. If we don't prosecute Trump, we won't politicize the justice system. And on the other axis, we have Trump faces consequences for what he did, or Trump doesn't face consequences for what he did. Somehow we wound up with the worst possible combination, where prosecutions actually happened and the justice system is politicized, at least in the minds of Trump supporters, and Trump faced no consequences for what he did. It's the worst possible combination. And I think that's because the decision was made to prosecute Trump for basically irrelevant things like the falsifying business records, where Trump was convicted and nothing happened. He still became president. I happen to think Trump tried to steal the election he lost to Biden. And maybe you could call that an insurrection because he gathered a group of people and inspired them to commit violence in pursuit of his goal to overturn the election where he lost. So maybe you could call it an insurrection. But there's this horrible disconnect between calling it an insurrection, Trump is an insurrectionist, and charging him with falsifying business records. It doesn't make sense. It's disconnected. You say he's trying to overturn the country and steal the election and coup the government, and you're going to give him a slap on the wrist. Should have filed that as a campaign expense, buddy. And you do it in a weird way where these falsifying business records to conceal a consensual sexual affair somehow become 34 felonies. It's like you're emphasizing the politicization of the justice system. Okay, let me try to put this back into the context of the book. What's happening in this chapter is comedian Tony Hinchcliffe has seemingly just called Puerto Rico an island of floating trash. And Harris's campaign is using that to attack the Trump campaign. How dare they? And in the middle of that attack, Biden jumps in to say the only trash I see is his supporters.
We're reading now from the book, October 27, 9 days to the election. At Trump's Madison Square Garden rally, the so-called comedian Tony Hinchcliffe opened with a vulgar, racist set that the MAGA audience strained to laugh at. The lowest moment came when he announced, "There's a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. I think it's called Puerto Rico." And then a couple days and chapters later, on October 30th, 6 days to the election, Harris's phone starts to blow up. Joe Biden, Trump supporters, garbage. Our campaign was going to have to clean it up. Just as I had been stepping onto the stage at the Ellipse, Joe had been on a Get Out the Vote call to the group Voto Latino. He was commenting on the Hinchcliffe floating island of garbage so-called joke at Trump's rally 3 days earlier. Joe said, "The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters," meaning the comedian's hateful rhetoric. But alas, on a Zoom call, no one can hear a possessive apostrophe. What everyone heard was the president calling Trump supporters garbage. It was covered as Hillary's deplorables comment on steroids. And this perception flew directly counter to the message of inclusion I had worked so hard to craft and communicate in my speech the night before. What had been a big problem for the Trump campaign had been turned instead into a mess for us.
Now, if you believe Harris, what Biden meant was Trump's supporters trash or something. Biden isn't actually calling Trump supporters trash, but whatever. Harris is upset that Biden has diverted media attention away from comedian Tony Hinchcliffe calling Puerto Rico trash to Biden apparently calling Trump supporters trash. Harris says it was like Hillary's deplorables comment on steroids. And the thing I want to say is, so what? If you think Trump is a fascist, racist, sexist, I think it's okay to call people who support a fascist, racist, sexist trash. I think that's fine. Compare it to what Donald Trump says of far leftists. He calls them vermin who have to be rooted out.
Of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections and will do anything possible. They'll do anything, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and to destroy the American dream. The real threat is not from the radical right. The real threat is from the radical left, and it's growing every day, every single day. The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. Our threat is from within.
And many other similar such things. It's like Harris is in a rhetorical boxing match against Trump, but she has one hand tied behind her back, and Trump is stabbing her. Harris is following a different set of rules than Trump is, and she kind of notices this. She says that there's a double standard. She's talking to a radio personality named Charlemagne. Charlemagne is saying that Harris seems scripted. She sticks to her talking points. And Harris says, well, that's called discipline. And then Harris contrasts herself with Trump. Trump is talking about electric sharks and Hannibal Lecter. And Charlemagne says that Harris seems scripted and she sticks to her talking points. I would say that's good critical feedback. But Harris, rather than taking the feedback and reflecting on it and trying to see how she might use it to grow, instead she debates the feedback or she rejects it. She says there's this double standard between Trump and I. Trump can talk about electric sharks and Hannibal Lecter, but anytime I repeat a line or get a little bit mixed up, I get criticized in the media for having a word salad moment or something like that. And that's this double standard that Harris is pointing to. But what she should be realizing, and what I think Charlemagne is getting at, is that the person enforcing the double standard is Harris herself. That is, it's actually not the case that Trump goes uncriticized for talking about electric sharks and Hannibal Lecter. There's a lot of people who make fun of Trump for that, or who criticize Trump for that, or who point out how crazy it is. That's all over mainstream media and social media. But the point is, whatever Trump loses in professionalism or decorum or something, whatever Trump loses by talking about electric sharks and Hannibal Lecter, he gains more by being an interesting, entertaining person. People will watch Trump. Trump doesn't seem scripted. Nobody would ever say of Trump that he sticks to his talking points, whereas that is a real criticism people are making of Harris. My main idea in this chapter is that yes, there is a double standard, but the lesson should not be, oh, there's a double standard, so we lose. That's why we lost. That's not the right takeaway. The takeaway should be, you are imposing the double standard on yourself. You are choosing to repeat your talking points ad nauseum, which makes you boring, rather than being entertaining. You are choosing to apologize for Biden maybe calling Trump supporters garbage, rather than staying on the offensive, which is what Harris is complaining about. I am not a Trump supporter. I don't like Donald Trump, but I have friends and family members who do like Donald Trump and who do support him. And if my friends or family were to come to me and say, oh, Biden called Trump supporters garbage, how do you feel about that? Do you agree? Do you think I'm garbage? I would say, shut up. Like, this is a childish thing for you to be concerned about, and don't bring this up to me again. Trump is out there saying far leftists are vermin. Immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. We've got to use the American military to root out the domestic enemy from within. Trump is out there saying stuff like this. You can't be out there going, oh, I'm sorry, someone made it sound like you might be garbage. It's the double standard that you are enforcing on yourself. If a reporter asked Kamala Harris, Madam Vice President, Biden has just characterized Trump supporters as garbage, do you agree with that characterization? If I were Kamala Harris, I would just start listing Trump's flaws. Look, Trump bragged about walking in on underage girls dressing. Trump brags about sexual assault. Trump was accused by his ex-wife of raping her. Trump was successfully sued by E. Jean Carroll of sexual assault. I would just start going through as many Trump flaws as I could until the reporter redirected me. Oh, Madam Vice President, we were talking about, Trump's characterization of Trump supporters as garbage. And I'd say, oh, well, you mean Trump who's calling far leftist vermin, who's saying immigrants are bringing drugs, crime, rapists. Trump saying immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. Is this the Donald Trump you're talking about? Yes, Madam Vice President. Do you agree that his supporters are garbage? Then I'd say, well, look, I think Donald Trump has shown us that in the social media era of politics might be a little bit more energetic, a little bit more kinetic. And so you've got to, toughen up, Snowflake. I'm not gonna indulge your fake tears about Biden maybe calling you garbage. Okay, that's something you're gonna have to deal with yourself. I just don't think you get anything by holding yourself to this double standard where Trump can be mean, but you can't be. Especially if Biden has already said it. Like, maybe you shouldn't preemptively go out there and say, Trump supporters are garbage. But you could, if the damage has already been done, I don't think, oh, I'm so sorry about that. I don't think begging for forgiveness is a benefit to you. I think if you're going to say Trump is a racist, sexist, fascist, etc., then refusing to be mean to Trump supporters, it's like signaling that you don't really believe in the fascist danger to America thing. They can't both be true. So you either have to be okay with being mean to Trump supporters, in which case, I guess feel free to call Trump a fascist or whatever. But if you're not okay with that, then I don't think you can really call Trump a fascist, because it just creates this disconnect where it seems like you don't believe what you're saying. Oh, Trump is a really bad guy, but the people who support him, they're good. They're all good. None of them are garbage. Like, you can't believe those two things. Chapter 3, bad plans. There actually aren't a lot of plans in this book. There's not a lot of planning, and Harris seems kind of resistant, surprisingly resistant to making plans. She tells us how her brother-in-law, Tony, had told her it would be political malpractice for her not to be prepared for Biden to drop out of the race. This is before they knew Biden was going to drop out of the race. The reason it would be political malpractice? Well, Biden, 81 years old at the time. So it's obvious that there's a chance Biden might drop out, that Biden might not be able to complete his term, and you might have to try to campaign by yourself. And Harris should have been aware of this herself. Being the president is actually the most dangerous job. Something like 10% of American presidents have died in office. And again, Biden is super old. There's just a chance, actuarially speaking, that an 80 or 81-year-old man might not make it to the end of his term. So Harris should have been prepared to run for office even before the disastrous debate between Biden and Trump, where Biden dropped out. But instead of being prepared, Harris actually willfully chooses to engage in this political malpractice of not being prepared. After her brother-in-law tells her it would be political malpractice not to be prepared, she doesn't do anything. She doesn't even engage in the planning process. She lets her brother-in-law, who's not even full-time working on this, put together what little semblance of a plan she has. And that's all she has in place when Biden does actually drop out. And reading that, thinking about that, it made me insane. I don't know if I should believe it or not. Maybe Harris is lying about it to cover for the fact that she did so poorly. Hopefully, she really had extensive plans in place, because it just seems crazy to me that you wouldn't plan for this obvious contingency. Harris wound up spending somewhere between $1 and $2 billion on her campaign. So couldn't you have just spent 1% of that amount of money in advance, getting ready for an eventuality where you might have to run? Heaven forbid something happens to Biden. Couldn't you have spent a few $1,000,000 and had a full-time staff of professionals working out what you would need to do? If you had engaged in that kind of planning, then you wouldn't be running around at the last second trying to find a good vice president. You would have had time to think about options and maybe do some polling or some focus groups. You could have talked to the super delegates in advance or worked on a campaign strategy. You could have been more prepared. The title of the book is about how Harris only had 107 days to run this campaign. But actually, she had a lot more if she had been able to foresee a very possible occurrence, right? We're not talking about a black swan. We're talking about maybe a slightly dusty colored swan, maybe a little unusual swan, maybe a light gray swan. This is not 81-year-old man can't complete term. That shouldn't have been a shock to Harris. That shouldn't have caught her off guard. She should have planned for it, and she didn't. So sorry, I've gone a long way off the topic of this chapter, which is bad plans. Not only does Harris sometimes inexplicably refuse to plan, she also, when she does plan, she makes bad plans. And the specific example that stuck out to me is when Harris is choosing her vice presidential candidate or nominee. So she has 3 people on her short list: Tim Walz, Josh Shapiro, and Mark Kelly. And she's bringing in these 3 people for a last final round interview between her and them to pick who she wants to be her candidate. And to set this up, she comes up with a plan. She's going to have her secretary or assistant, a woman named Storm something, go pick up the candidate and drive them to Harris's office. And they pick Storm in part because Storm has a Jeep that's there at the office every day. So the press won't be suspicious. The candidate can just duck down. The press won't be suspicious of Storm driving her car in, same car she drives in every day. And I guess they'll sneak by the press if they're doing this. And the second part of the plan is that Storm is a former employee at an ambassador's office, and she's used to decorum and judging people or something. And so Storm is going to be perceived as less powerful than the potential vice president nominee, but Storm will be able to secretly judge them and then give Harris information, is this guy secretly a jerk to secretaries or something? So this is a bad plan for a lot of reasons. I hope I can remember all of them. First, for no reason. For no reason, Storm changes her car. She gets a different car. And that does arouse the press's suspicion that a new car is driving into the office. And they don't explain why Storm chose a new car. Harris calls out that they used Storm to drive the candidates into the office because the press recognizes Storm's car and wouldn't be suspicious of it. And then with no commentary or explanation, Harris just says that Storm drove a new car, a different car, the day she went to go pick up the candidates. So immediately, step one of a pretty simple plan, Storm, drive your car to pick up the candidate, the plan goes immediately off the rails on step one for no reason that's ever explained. Second problem, Harris had already told CNN 2 days before who was on her shortlist. She already gave them those 3 names. So why do you have to conceal who is in the Jeep, who is coming to visit you? Why do you have to conceal this at all? The whole plan doesn't even make any sense. Not only did you immediately diverge from the plan, the one part of the plan that mattered, you immediately changed that so that the plan failed, but also you didn't need to do the plan in the first place. You had already told CNN who was on your shortlist. They had already reported it. So it's not really a secret that you would have final interviews with people on your shortlist. That doesn't make sense. Point 3, the press found out about it anyway. CNN reported multiple times that day that Josh Shapiro, for example, was visiting Harris to do a final round of interviews. And they reported on it because Shapiro drove in his motorcade. So they saw that coming. Fourth, one of the reasons why Harris says she needs to do this plan with Storm is because Harris says that her mother was a research scientist, but also a small brown woman who wasn't taken seriously. And so now Harris is going to send Storm, pictured here, to go meet the VP candidates. And I guess it's like to see if they're racist, because why would you say the thing about your mother not being taken seriously because she was a brown woman? But then if you're worried that the VP candidate is going to secretly be a racist, but also that they're still willing to be your VP candidate, like, why aren't you sending one of the Southeast Asian people who works for you to go drive the governor? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then 5, I don't think it matters that much if the VP candidate is nice to your secretary or not. I don't want to sound heartless. I'm a polite person. I'm polite to waiters and secretaries and everyone. I try to be polite to everyone. But consider when Harris meets Josh Shapiro, she describes him as professional, an impressive campaigner, smart, prepared, ready, and so on. But on the other hand, she says that Shapiro was disappointed he had to sit in the back seat of Storm's Jeep. Or rather, Storm thought he might have seemed a little disappointed. And so that's what I'm trying to get at when I say the test just doesn't make a lot of sense. What did Harris learn from it? That Shapiro might be a little disappointed to ride in the backseat of a Jeep when he didn't need to, when Harris had already told the press that Shapiro was on her shortlist and the press had already seen and reported on Shapiro's motorcade going to visit Harris. Shapiro is a little bit disappointed that he has to ride in the backseat of a Jeep. Why does that matter in context to he's the governor of a state you need to win? He's a smart, sophisticated campaigner. He's intelligent. All those other positive things you said seem like they matter a huge amount. And maybe slightly disappointed to ride in the backseat of a Jeep matters no amount. That doesn't matter at all. So why are you even considering it? Why is that even in the book? The plan that you didn't need, that didn't work, that didn't tell you anything, why is that in the book at all relative to a kind of interesting analysis of the different candidates and why they might be good or bad? That's what I wanted to read. But instead, it's stuff like Operation Veep in a Jeep.
This story is so silly, I worry you might think I'm exaggerating it. I'm not. Reading from the book, quote, I'd recruited my invaluable social secretary and residence manager, Storm Horncastle, to collect each finalist in her 99 Jeep Wrangler. The press was used to seeing her coming and going from the residence, so if her passenger ducked, no one would know he was here. We dubbed it Operation Veep in a Jeep. I had an ulterior motive for recruiting Storm for this job. Storm is from Norway, not especially political, and had mostly worked in embassies prior to taking the job with me at the vice president's residence. She has an exquisitely tuned sense of protocol, is an excellent judge of character, and does not hold back her opinions. I thought it would be telling to see how each finalist treated her. Over the years, I'd learned it's one thing how people treat me. It's another how they behave towards someone they perceive as less powerful. I'm especially sensitive to this because as a child, I saw how my mother, a small brown woman with a foreign accent, would be treated in a fancy department store and other places as if she didn't belong or couldn't afford to be there. She was a distinguished scientist doing groundbreaking research, but often I saw her encounter derision and disrespect. I needed to know that my running mate was a person who valued the dignity of everyone and would take a moment to show it. And then, when Storm goes out to pick up Josh Shapiro, Storm had picked him up from the parking lot of an elementary school in Glover Park. At the last minute, Storm had traded her Jeep for a vehicle with tinted windows. Since discretion was important to us in this process, Josh went to get in the front seat, but Storm instructed that he needed to be in the back so he could duck and not be seen. And not been seen? Okay, whatever. She thought he seemed a little disappointed by that.
Speaking of bad vice presidential plans, Harris considers Pete Buttigieg. She likes Pete.
Reading from the book, I might as well say that Pete Buttigieg was my first choice for vice president. Harvard grad, multilingual Rhodes Scholar, business consultant, naval intelligence officer, twice elected Midwestern mayor, cabinet secretary, loving husband and father, he was well suited in so many respects. I love Pete. I love working with Pete. He and his husband, Chasten, are friends. He is a sincere public servant with the rare talent of being able to frame liberal arguments in a way that makes it possible for conservatives to hear them. He knows the importance of taking our case to people who aren't usually exposed to it and is magnificent at sparring with our opponents on Fox News. He would have been an ideal partner if I were a straight white man. But we were already asking a lot of America to accept a woman, a black woman married to a Jewish man. Part of me wanted to say, screw it, let's just do it. But knowing what was at stake, it was too big of a risk. And I think Pete also knew that, to our mutual sadness. In other words, Harris wanted Pete Buttigieg to be VP, but she chose not to pick him because Pete is gay, right? That's what she's saying here.
And I think this is a bad plan because when Harris introduces her actual VP pick, Tim Walz, to the country, one of the first things she says about Walz is that he was the faculty mentor at his high school's gay-straight alliance club. So if you're trying to court the homophobic voter by turning down Pete Buttigieg, it's odd that one of the first things you say about your vice presidential pick is that he was involved in running a club for gay high school students after school. If I could put on my homophobia hat for a second, I don't think the homophobic voter is going to say, oh, gay-straight alliance? I like straight. I think that it's going to be off-putting to the homophobic voter to say an adult man was running a club for gay high school students, potentially more off-putting than having a gay vice presidential pick. I'm not certain. But my point is, there are two principles here. One is treating people equally regardless of their sexuality, and two is political expediency, doing what you need to win. And Harris is simultaneously violating both of these principles, I think. She's violating the first principle by refusing to pick Pete because he's gay, and the second principle by talking about how her actual VP pick was involved in gay youth clubs. It's a bad set of things to do together. In my opinion, you should pick one principle and stick to it, or do both principles somehow, but don't figure out how to violate both principles. That's just bad. I don't even agree with Harris that Pete would have been a liability for her campaign. In the 2020 Democratic primary, Pete Buttigieg did a lot better than Harris. He got more electoral votes, he did better in the polls. So I don't understand the idea that he would have been a problem for her campaign. If anything, Harris would have been a problem for her campaign. So if the principle of political expediency says America's not ready for a gay vice president, we can't have Pete running, shouldn't that same principle make you wonder if America's ready for a black woman to be president? And it seems like a really hard question to ask, to say, should Harris have ran? Shouldn't she have thought about this same principle that she used to exclude Pete to wonder, at least wonder, if she should maybe not run herself, if she should exclude herself. Or you could even take a step further back in time to say, should Harris have thought that the principle of political expediency should make her challenge Biden in a primary? Imagine going into the election in time for a full primary. Harris had come out and said that she did not support Biden, that Biden was too old and she wasn't going to be supporting him, that she was primarying him, running against him. That might have pulled in other Democratic Party challengers to really challenge Biden and Harris and do a full Democratic primary. Of course, the logic at the time, you would have to consider that it would weaken Biden against Trump, or it might make Trump more likely to win. But with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that it couldn't have hurt. Trump won anyway. So I think it's the task of a reflection like this book to show us, the readers, what Harris was thinking at the time and why she made the decision she made. And yet, Harris never even considers, she never contemplates not running herself or challenging Biden in the primary. That doesn't come up, that's not a single page, that's not a single sentence, that's not a single word, it's not a single letter in this book. There's no part of this book where she contemplates those ideas. And I think she should have. If she actually contemplated those ideas in reality, she should explain them to us in the book. And if she didn't contemplate them in reality, that seems like a big gap. She should have thought about stuff like that. Even if she didn't wind up making that decision, I would hope that she would at least consider it. Chapter 5, a lack of confidence. Quote,
We're reading from the book. It was Doug's birthday. He and I were born 7 days apart. We joked that he dropped down to earth to check out the situation a week before I arrived. We are both Libras, and friends who believe in astrology say it is totally unsurprising that we spend half an hour to an hour weighing the pros and cons of which TV show we will want to watch. And by the time we've settled it, it's time to go to bed.
The president is the chief executive. The president should be decisive. And I don't like the anecdotes that make it seem like Harris has trouble making decisions. Or I don't like that she believes in astrology, kind of. Or I don't like the fact that she sometimes doubts decisions that she's made. She's filled with self-doubt. Quote,
Back to the book. In the morning, as usual, Doug was up before me. He likes to make his coffee from scratch. I've pointed out to him that there are machines that grind the beans and make the brew so that it's all ready for you when you wake up, but he's not interested. He likes his system. I was standing there in my bathrobe waiting for the noise of the grinder to stop. Honey, I said, have I made the right choice? I hate being indecisive, but there I was. Doug turned and gave me a look. Your gut is always right. Trust it. In context, they're talking about the choice to pick Tim Walz as her VP candidate.
trust your gut isn't really good advice. You're not a Jedi blowing up a Death Star. You're trying to make a decision. You should have well-informed, articulatable reasons why you made the decisions you made. So in the context of choosing a vice presidential candidate, I think that Harris should be able to say, look, we want X, Y, Z from the vice president. Walz has X and Y. He's a little weak on Z, but we think we can mitigate it with this. I think she should have some articulatable logic underlying her decision that she should know about. And in moments of self-doubt, she should think back through why she did what she did. And it should be more compelling than just she liked him or he seemed authentic. Quote,
Back to the book. Walz is meeting Harris for his final interview. He was immediately self-critical. I'm not a good debater. I've never used a teleprompter. He was less polished than Josh Shapiro, but he had an appealing authenticity and was genuinely self-deprecating. A lot of people in politics act self-deprecating, but it's just that, an act. If anything, Tim over-indexed his own liabilities. A guy who could talk knowledgeably to a farmer about hogs and soybeans. A guy who knew what it meant to hunt in fall, to put food in the freezer to last through winter. None of it was shtick. It is just who he was.
But that's really all Harris has to recommend Walz. Just this kind of, I feel like maybe Walz is a good guy. Lack of confidence isn't just these anecdotes. I think it connects back to what I started with. It's confidence that keeps Harris from going on podcasts like Joe Rogan's, or if Joe Rogan is a bad fit, like Theo Vaughn's, or whatever other podcasts are out there that might have a big audience, especially of people who Harris was losing. Whatever else you want to say about Donald Trump, he doesn't lack confidence. And I think that's partly why he was able to go on so many different podcasts and programs and talk so much and present himself in front of so many different audiences. He has the self-confidence to be able to do that, to have wide-ranging, unstructured interviews. And I think that goes to why Trump was winning low information or low propensity voters. People who aren't that interested in politics see Donald Trump on a channel that they like, and they go, well, he's a good guy. I enjoyed that talk. It was an interesting, entertaining talk. And maybe that helps Trump win some of these low propensity voters. And that's an area where Harris lost. And I think confidence plays a role in that. The president should be confident, in my opinion. If you are confident, act like it. And if you're not confident, maybe president isn't a great job. This is not some office job where we say, oh, it's imposter syndrome, believe in yourself. This is a pretty important job, President. It's like if your surgeon were to say, oh, well, this operation's kind of tough. I think I got it. I probably have it. I'll figure it out. You wouldn't say, okay, go ahead, doctor. You'd say, can I get a new surgeon? Like, I actually want my surgeon to believe in their ability to operate and perform a procedure. And I want the president to be able to make decisions for good, reasonable, articulatable reasons. And this book made me doubt that Harris would do that. Chapter 6, People Hate Joe Biden.
From the book, Biden has just dropped out and Harris is giving her first speech. All the questioning about his capacity had wounded him badly. He didn't want to get out of the race. He didn't want to stop being president. I was determined that he at least have his dignity. My feelings for him were grounded in warmth and loyalty, but they had become complicated over time with hurt and disappointment. At that moment, the warmth predominated. So, when I took the stage, I spent the first third of my remarks effusively praising him before I launched into my own campaign speech. I would do that for several weeks until my campaign strategists urged me to stop. It's time this campaign was about you. It was David Plouffe who would eventually put it to me more bluntly. People hate Joe Biden.
Harris should not have needed anybody to tell her that people hated Joe Biden. She should have known that. I knew that. She could have learned people hated Joe Biden by reading polls or watching the news or being on social media. There were all sorts of ways she could have learned for herself that people hate Joe Biden. And she probably should have learned that. She should have been able to guess it from the bad economic conditions. Just from first principles, she should have thought, people probably don't like a president if he's president and there's a horrible economic condition. People would probably dislike the president. She should have been able to figure that out. But okay, she didn't figure it out. Her advisor had to tell her. Fine, that's okay. We can still salvage this. That's okay. I'm not a politician, but my intuition is it's bad to be associated with stuff people don't like. If you're a politician and you're associated to someone who people hate, you should probably figure out how to separate yourself from that guy that people hate. And yet, even after Harris is told that people hate Joe Biden, she's not able to separate herself. She goes on The View and they ask this.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
And on reflection, Harris thinks,
back in the book, this is the chapter about Harris's appearance on The View. She writes, everything about my appearance on The View was going well until it wasn't. Sonny asked a follow-up. If anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden over the past 4 years? I had prepped for that question. I had notes on it. There was the answer I'd given in the debate. I'm not Joe Biden, and I'm certainly not Donald Trump. I had a note that I was a new and different generation, and I had this. But to specifically answer your question, throughout my career, I have worked with Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and I know that great ideas come from all places. If I'm president, I would appoint a Republican to my cabinet. But I didn't say any of that. I said, there is not a thing that comes to mind. I had no idea I'd just pulled the pin on a hand grenade. I wasn't braced for the explosion that was coming. Stationed at various places around the set, my staff were beside themselves. Political operatives have an eye to see a moment, and I could kick myself for giving the other side that moment. During the commercial break, while I was having a bit of fun with some young students I'd noticed in the audience, who are obviously playing hooky, offering to write notes to their teachers after the show, Opal passed me a note from our team, telling me to return to that question and mention that a big difference would be that I would put a Republican in my cabinet. I made that point, but the damage was done. The earlier clip was a gift to the Trump campaign, and they used it in ad after ad to shackle me to an unpopular president. Why didn't I separate myself from Joe Biden? Over the course of the 107 days, I became increasingly aware that people wanted to know there was a separation and that it was a big issue for them. I just didn't realize how big. The way I heard Sonny's question was that it was asking me to be critical of Joe. I've never believed you need to elevate yourself by pushing someone else down. To do so would have been to embrace the cruelty of my opponent. Again, it's not like they aren't asking you to roast Joe Biden. People don't think things are going well. They're asking Harris to separate herself from Biden, to identify the policies that aren't working and explain how she would fix or improve on them.
It's pretty bad that Harris didn't have a good answer on The View, but it's worse that even on reflection, Harris doesn't have a good answer. Her internal monologues, like she's trying to come up with the worst possible answer, and she succeeded. A Republican in the cabinet. Oh, great. Thank you, Madam Vice President. I don't think that's what people want. If the voters wanted Republicans in the cabinet, they'd vote for Trump. You have to explain why people should vote for you. Nobody suspects that Harris is actually Joe Biden in a wig. They know that Harris and Joe Biden are different people. But what people want to know is how Harris is going to be different from Biden in terms of policy, in terms of what she's going to do as president. It's like if I were sick and I went to the doctor and the doctor gave me some medicine and I kept getting worse, so I went to a new doctor and I asked the second doctor, hey, what are you going to do that's different from the first doctor? And the second doctor said, probably the same thing. That would be a problem. That would be what I don't want. I want something different. I want the second doctor to say, here's what I think is wrong. Here's what the first doctor did, and here's what I'm going to do that's different. And here's why what I'm going to do that's different will work. Harris, in this metaphor, if you didn't get it, Harris is the second doctor. And she's saying, I'm basically going to do the same thing that Joe Biden did. That's not good. There's no difference in I'm going to have a Republican in the cabinet. I don't think that clearly separates Harris from Biden. How is having a Republican in the cabinet going to help pay for groceries or affordability? How is it going to address what people are mad at? How is it going to isolate why people hate Biden and separate yourself from that? Harris didn't explain on The View. Harris doesn't explain in the book. I think it's a really bad answer. Chapter 7, Losing Billionaires.
October 14, 22 days until the election. The Los Angeles Times, my hometown newspaper, published its electoral endorsements. The very first line of the article stated, "It's no exaggeration to say this may be the most consequential election in a generation." But there was no mention of the most consequential race of all. The paper's owner, Patrick Soon-Shiong, had directed the editorial's editor, Mariel Garza, to deep six the endorsement of me that the editorial board had approved and she had already drafted. She quit. In her resignation letter, Garza said it mattered that the largest newspaper in California declined to endorse in a race this important. And it matters that we won't even be straight with people about it. It makes us look craven and hypocritical, maybe even a bit sexist and racist, she wrote. How could we spend 8 years railing against Trump and the danger his leadership poses to the country, and then fail to endorse the perfectly decent Democrat challenger who we previously endorsed for the U.S. Senate? It hurt that my hometown paper hadn't endorsed me. And then 11 days later, my other hometown paper, the Washington Post, did the same thing. The endorsement of me that had been prepared by the editorial board was scrapped at the direction of Jeff Bezos. The pre-capitulation of these powerful billionaires alarmed and dispirited me. As it turned out, they were early adopters of the feckless posture that would be embraced by a raft of business leaders and institutions once Trump was elected. They'd just been the first in line to grovel. Marty Baron, the acclaimed former editor who led the Post during the first Trump presidency, was blunt. This is cowardice, a moment of darkness that will leave democracy as a casualty. Donald Trump will celebrate this as an invitation to further intimidate the Post's owner, Jeff Bezos, and other media owners. History will mark a disturbing chapter of spinelessness at an institution famed for courage.
I see it a little bit differently. I don't think it was the lack of spine that caused the billionaire-owned newspapers to not endorse Harris. I don't think it was the presence of a spine that made the billionaire-owned newspapers endorse Biden. Instead, I think it was the fact that the billionaires thought Harris would lose, and that's why they didn't endorse her. If you're on a ship and you see all the rats jumping off the ship into the ocean, you shouldn't waste your time yelling about, oh, you dirty rats abandoning us when things are getting bad. Instead, you should think, oh no, the ship is sinking. And you should spend your time and energy trying to fix your sinking ship, not yelling at the fleeing rats. The billionaires, in other words, think she's going to lose. That should be a signal. And that actually brings me to polling. Harris doesn't spend a lot of time in the book thinking about or analyzing or discussing polling. When she does mention it, she basically dismisses it. She says she never would have ran for office in the first place, her first office, if she had paid that much attention to polling. And I think that's kind of a problem. I think you should be paying attention to polling. You should have your own pollster. You might know that people hate Joe Biden if you paid attention to polling. For example, the reason you want to pay attention to polling is because you want to know if you're winning or losing. That matters a lot. If you're winning, keep doing what you're doing. That's working. You're winning. You want to prevent big changes to change the outcome of the election. On the other hand, if you're losing, you're going to have to do something different. You want to seek out big changes to really upset and change the election. And there's going to be risk with that. You're going to want to take more risk because the status quo, if you're losing, is bad. That means you just lose. So you want to take risks to take a big change, to get a big change, and that should be your goal. So it matters a lot if you're winning or losing. Harris doesn't engage with polling. The next best thing might be something like noticing rats fleeing a sinking ship, noticing that billionaires are not endorsing you, noticing that some of the most powerful, politically connected people in the country think you're going to lose. If they thought Harris was going to win, they would be pre-capitulating to Harris, and they're not. Rather than analyze it like that, or think about the signal it sends, or even consider why these billionaires aren't endorsing her, why don't they like her, why aren't they supporting her the way that the Washington Post did in 2020 for Biden, or even before that. Remember, Bezos's Washington Post did the whole democracy dies in darkness thing during Trump's first term. So it seems like there should be a big question mark for why Silicon Valley billionaires stopped supporting the Democratic Party, why they aren't supporting you. That should be something you should explore. You should think about the signal and the information you're getting from the fact that these billionaires aren't supporting you. But Harris doesn't do any of that in the book. Instead, she just kind of observes that it happens. She's upset that it happened, and she's blaming the billionaires, I guess. And to be clear, sure, the billionaires deserve their own blame. They're making their own choices. But this isn't a book written by Jeff Bezos. It's not explaining why Bezos did what he did. I'm trying to see why Harris did what she did. And it's her responsibility to act on the information that she has. It's her responsibility to try to win. And I don't get any of that in the book. It's like I've mentioned in other chapters. She just observes that things are happening. It's not working out for her. It's not good. She blames other people. And then we move on without ever figuring out why these things went bad and what could have been done to fix it. Losing the endorsement of the billionaire-owned newspapers, I'm sure that hurts. But does it really hurt that much? I mean, are people who read the Washington Post, Are they not going to vote for Harris because the Post didn't explicitly endorse her? I don't know. I'm unsure of that. But I do know that losing the endorsement of these billionaires, that does also give you an opportunity. It's something else you could talk about. Jeff Bezos isn't endorsing me because Bezos and his billionaire buddy Donald Trump want what's best for the billionaires running this country. I'm standing up for you. Harris could use language like that. She could use messaging like that or campaign like that. So billionaires not endorsing her is simultaneously an opportunity for her to try to win. The billionaires are trying to stop me. The billionaires are trying to stop me because they know that Donald Trump's going to cut their taxes and I'm going to make them pay their fair share. But again, there's just nothing like that at all in the book. She doesn't consider how the reverse might be used to help her. That is, a bad thing happens to her. She's not endorsed by the newspapers. She doesn't think about how she could turn that into an opportunity to see. I don't want my leaders to say, no, bad things happened to me, so I lost. I want them to say, bad things happened to me. Here's how I turned them around. Here's how I changed the situation, took advantage of other opportunities. Here's how I counteracted the bad things that happened to me and ultimately prevailed. There are a lot of parts of this book that could be really interesting, and Harris just dodges all of the interesting moments, in my view. For example, I feel like this chapter would be a really interesting chapter to dig in on the connection between billionaires, especially in Silicon Valley, and politics, and how billionaires influence politics and determine what politicians do. I would like to hear about that firsthand from someone who's actually been really high up in American politics. I would have loved to hear Harris explore and analyze that, but she doesn't. It's just the billionaires didn't endorse me. Moving on. I also think Elon Musk is kind of a particular example. In the book, Harris references Musk being upset by the fact that he wasn't invited to Electric Car Day. And I've actually heard of that from Elon Musk himself. I've heard of it from his friends, and I've heard it in other news reporting. That makes me think Elon Musk probably was upset by not being invited to this Electric Car Day. And I also think that it's probably not a big deal if Elon Musk goes to Electric Car Day or not. I personally never would have known that Electric Car Day existed if it weren't for the fact that there's all this talk about Elon Musk not being invited. And finally, on this topic, I'll say that Elon Musk being vehemently opposed to Harris, that was kind of a big deal. He bought Twitter, turned it into X. He campaigned with Trump, gave Trump tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to try to win the presidency. So on the one hand, we have Musk going to Electric Car Day. Irrelevant, inconsequential, nobody cares. Musk being Harris's sworn enemy, that hugely impactful. It makes me wonder if something like a second Electric Car Day could have been thrown, if Harris could have taken a day on her campaign to do a celebration of American entrepreneurs and American businessmen or the American electric car. Maybe she could give a special little medal to Elon Musk, number one electric car manufacturer. And a second special medal, just number one car manufacturer. That's how much I love Tesla's, Elon. And okay, maybe that's a little degrading. Maybe it's beneath the office of the presidency or whatever. But I would go back to what I said earlier about political expediency. If we have this thing that doesn't really matter, like Electric Car Day, and we have another thing that does really matter, like Elon Musk using his tens of billions of dollars, who knows how many billions of dollars, to help Trump win, maybe we could do the thing that doesn't really matter to negate the thing that does really matter. I don't know. I wish Harris would have thought about that. I wish she would have thought about how to solve the problems that she actually has, especially in an unorthodox or out-of-the-box way of doing it. I wish she would have tried to come up with some solutions. And I just don't see that at all in the book.
We're reading from the book, 86 Days to the Election. Quote, before my speech, I had a meet and greet with some high-level donors. I pulled aside one of the most long-standing and generous, a leader in Silicon Valley. My head close to his ear, I said, I'm concerned about Musk. Are you guys on top of it? I wanted reassurance that the tech people who supported democracy were putting resources into combating mis- and disinformation. We needed a counterforce to whatever might be brewing, and I knew that the campaign I'd inherited didn't have the skill set or the resources for it. The people I knew in Silicon Valley had a much better grasp of how deep the roots went, how far they spread. Elon Musk had set off my spidey senses long before his MAGAification and his endorsement of Trump. Both SpaceX and Tesla sprang to life in California, and millions of California taxpayers had helped the companies prosper. But when Democrats tried to tie electric car subsidies to workplace standards, Tesla had been sued for labor violations, including racial discrimination and suppressing union organizing efforts. Musk began a rightward pivot. It accelerated during COVID, when he refused to close the Tesla plant to protect the health of his workers. When he moved his operations to Texas, he claimed it was because the state offered more freedom, which was the height of hypocrisy, since Texas, with its draconian abortion ban and the privacy-shedding policies around it, violated the most basic of human liberties. Musk is a talented entrepreneur, but there are genius engineers behind the cars and rockets, such as Tesla's former longtime chief technical officer, J.B. Straubel, who deserve just as much credit. Despite what I think of Musk, I believe Joe Biden made a mistake in not inviting him to the White House in 2021 for an event promoting our electric vehicle policy. I shared this view with his team. Behind the president on the lawn that day were electric Fords, Chevys, Jeeps. American-made Teslas, then the world's most innovative and successful electric cars, were nowhere to be seen. Biden, loyal to the UAW, was sending a message about Musk's anti-union stance. But as President of the United States, if you are convening the nation's manufacturers of electric vehicles, and the biggest player in the field is not there, it simply doesn't make sense. Musk never forgave it. Since he had acquired Twitter and sacked its content moderators and fact-checkers, the platform had become a den of conspiracy theories and alt-right bile. It was also, increasingly, Musk's personal megaphone for boosting Trump and denigrating me. Musk had announced that he would interview Trump live on X the next evening. He would deliver Trump the opportunity to spew his lies, free of fact-checking. And in the days that followed, he would deliver a whole lot more. A few things I want to notice about this. First, it's not her fault. She's actually been on top of Elon Musk a long time. Musk set off her spidey senses long before his MAGAification. It's someone else's fault. So she's deploying this long-standing, generous leader in Silicon Valley, unnamed by the way. She's deploying this unnamed person to take care of Musk. I'm concerned about Musk. Are you guys on top of it? No, Madam Vice President. Apparently they aren't on top of it. So she knew about this problem. She told Biden it was a problem. She's putting her expert on it. It's not her fault, right? But I would say it is her fault. I would say there's a symmetry between how she addresses Musk or treats Musk here. She says, look, Tesla was a huge success, but Musk doesn't deserve all the credit. There are also other people working at Tesla who deserve just as much credit. And the symmetry here is that the person in charge gets the credit. Musk led Tesla or SpaceX, all of his different companies, so Musk is the one who gets most of the credit if those things succeed. And likewise, when your plans fail, if you're the person in charge, you deserve most of the blame because you're the person organizing and setting up and executing the system. So I would say it is Harris's fault here. She's the one who should be taking care of things. She's the one who chooses to deploy her long-standing, generous Silicon Valley leader to take care of Musk. And it doesn't work out. Musk doesn't come back to the Democrats. He becomes their enemy. So it's kind of a failure from Harris. And again, Harris says that Biden made a mistake not inviting Musk to the electric car day thing. And okay, that was a mistake from Biden. But this is not Biden's book. We're not analyzing what Biden did. We're looking at what Harris did. And how is Harris going to fix that mistake? How did she put it right? Seemingly, she didn't do anything apart from talk to an unnamed Silicon Valley leader.
Chapter 8, White People. White people are the biggest voting group, and they voted for Trump, especially white men, but also white women. So that's a bad combination when the biggest group of voters is voting for your opponent. So that's a big problem that Harris needs to solve. So how would you appeal to the white male voter, or white voters generally? I think what I would do is I would look at polling data and I'd look at focus groups and I'd try to find what concerns do white male voters have, or do white voters have generally. And then I'd try to address those concerns and explain why I am better on those issues than Donald Trump. But if Harris was trying that, she's not explicit about it in the book. She doesn't explain that anywhere. There's no part of the book where she's going over data, figuring out what white men want to hear and how she can present that viewpoint to them to encourage them to vote for her. Harris doesn't totally ignore the white voter question. I think she's picking her vice president to be a white man. All three of the people on her finalist list are white men. So to me, it seems like maybe she's intentionally picking a white man. But that has the same problem that her method of separating herself from Joe Biden has. That is, she says, I would have separated myself from Joe Biden by having a Republican in my cabinet. Well, you can't out-Republican the Republicans. And similarly, you can't out-represent them either. That is, the person who's going to vote for you because you have a white man as your vice president, that person would probably vote for the two white men running against you. So, maybe picking a white man for VP, maybe that's good. Again, she doesn't explicitly say, I'm intentionally picking from just a white man for my vice president in order to appeal to white men. That part isn't in the book, but I think implicitly, I think it's there. I think it's implied. Anyway, the other way she tries to appeal to white people or white men is by having the group White Dudes for Harris. Now, on the one hand, I feel like this group is a little bit odd. I feel like it's odd to have race, gender for me as your political group. But on the other hand, I don't want to be too critical of this or ding Harris too much, because I do think it's good to try things. And that's kind of a new thing she's trying. And like I was saying earlier, she needs to be high variance. She needs to try stuff that might make a change. So I applaud her for trying this, but she doesn't really get into what the group was supposed to do, other than just being a group of white male supporters of Harris. She doesn't talk about, what she did to further the group or what goals the group had or anything like that. Instead, it seems like the group was kind of separately run and Harris didn't have much interaction with it. And maybe it didn't do that much overall. Or if it did, Harris doesn't comment on it in the book. So it's kind of like there's a real lack of importance or significance or emphasis on this issue, which I understand it's uncomfortable to think about it. It's kind of racializing politics and then specifically trying to appeal to white voters. That seems, it seems like we're entering quasi-racist territory. But on the other hand, white voters are the biggest voting group and you're losing them, and you have to figure out how not to lose them. And there's very little, or I would say no analysis, nothing that I remember certainly, in the book about how to solve the issue of the white voter. And I think that's a big gap.
The word white occurs 66 times in the book. Almost all of the references are to the White House, and occasionally Harris refers to white as in white people. For example, on page 46, she refers to a woman who's setting her up to meet her husband, Doug. The woman who's setting her up employs Harris. Don't Google Doug. She was afraid I'd see some corporate headshot of a bland white guy and back out of the date. So that's a reference to white as a racial group, I guess. Then again, mostly it's white as in White House. Most of the references are White House. There's white hair, white jacket, white tie. And finally, on page 200, we have a reference to the group White Dudes for Harris. This group is interesting. It comes from the work of an entrepreneur and activist named Jotaka Yedi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if not. Jotaka organized a group, Win with Black Women, to try to get black women candidates elected. And she writes, quote, after that first Zoom call, others contacted Jotaka to ask how to do the same thing. From her mentoring came Win with Black Men, White Dudes for Harris, White Women Answer the Call, Comics for Kamala, Deadheads for Kamala, Cat Ladies for Kamala, and so on. So notice that it's another woman who had the idea. Jotaka started putting this together. And it's unnamed others who contacted Jotaka to organize the groups, including White Dudes for Harris doesn't seem to do anything. She never mentions this group again. This is the only reference for White Dudes for Harris. Again, this is one of the largest demographic groups, and Harris is losing white people, and especially white men, by a significant margin. And the only reference to trying to appeal to white male voters is this group organized by unnamed other people after those other people were inspired by a different person. Harris had no involvement in organizing or executing this. She doesn't mention White Dudes for Harris again. She doesn't do anything with the group. It's just, oh, I hope other people acting on their own initiative solve the biggest problem for me, that the largest demographic group isn't voting for me. It seems like very poor and foolish leadership. And just for the sake of completeness, the other references to white people, as opposed to white houses or white things and so on, is when Harris is discussing her visit to the South. And she says that when most people think of the South, they think of white people. But actually, Harris goes to rural America in order to visit rural counties that are majority black, and discusses the systems of oppression that disadvantaged black farmers historically. And to be clear, I think that's fine. I think it's good to acknowledge such things. But I also think that if you're trying to win an election, and white people are the largest voting group, and you're losing white people, you do have to spend some level of attention. You have to think about how you can win the white voter. Otherwise, you are simply not going to win the election.
Chapter 9, Agency. The chapters are getting faster. We're almost done with this video that I know you're enjoying. It's great. It's great. But I've spent a lot of time making it, and I'm ready to be done with this video. Anyway, agency. Agency is the property where you do the thing that you want to do. And there's this chapter in Harris's book that horrified me when I read it, because she represents Vance, J.D. Vance, as having high agency and herself as having low agency in this chapter. So in the chapter, Harris is complaining about Air Force Two, her jet. She says it's an old plane. It seems to be not perfectly maintained. Her chair doesn't work that well. The door to the bathroom doesn't work that well. And the plane is delayed for some reason. And Harris finds out it's because J.D. Vance is walking on the tarmac. And later, when they ask him why he's walking on the tarmac, violating the safety rules, delaying Harris's flight, Vance's answer is that he just wanted to see his future plane. So I say that's an example of Vance having high agency. He's doing what he wants to do. He's violating the rules. You shouldn't be out there walking on the tarmac. He's inconveniencing other people. It's probably dangerous to walk out there on the tarmac. But he's doing what he wants to do. High agency doesn't mean that you're a good person. It doesn't mean that everything you do is right. It means you're doing what you want to do, regardless of what obstacles there are. You're overcoming those obstacles. And conversely, Harris simultaneously portrays herself as low agency. Oh, my chair doesn't work that right. The door to the bathroom gets stuck. Well, fix it. She says in the book that this is an infrastructure problem she's not going to be able to fix. Really? You're vice president. You can't tell your chief of staff or the maintenance crew or someone, hey, fix that door. You can't make that happen. Making stuff happen, regardless of the obstacles or the bureaucratic processes or whatever, making stuff happen, regardless of whatever gets in your way, that's like the duty of the chief executive. That's the duty of the president or an executive in any organization. You have to make stuff happen. And the fact that Harris paints herself as someone who doesn't make stuff happen, I find that really concerning. I find it really horrifying.
90 days to the election. We landed at Chippewa Valley Regional Airport to be greeted by local officials. I got into my motorcade, but we weren't pulling out. I asked Max why we weren't leaving. That was when I learned we were being held up by J.D. Vance. He was out of his car and walking toward Air Force Two, in violation of every rule of security and protocol. I later learned that he told reporters he was there because, quote, I just wanted to check out my future plane, end quote. Had I known that he was pulling that juvenile stunt, I would have been inclined to step from my car and use a word I believe best pronounced correctly. It begins with an M and ends with ah. By now, I suppose he'll be well acquainted with that old plane. It came into service for Al Gore in 1998, and it's hard to replace, since Boeing no longer makes a jet as compact, yet high-powered, able to take off and land at smaller airports like Chippewa Valley Regional. Vance will have learned that the vice president's seat resists adjustment when you want to move it, but flies unexpectedly forward at inopportune moments. He'll know that the door to the restroom doesn't always stay closed, or may not even open. Wrestling with that door as we were trying to fix America's infrastructure problems, I knew this was one infrastructure problem I would not be able to fix. Why would you say that about yourself? This was one infrastructure problem you would not be able to fix? If you think you can fix America's infrastructure problems, fixing a stuck door on your plane should be trivial. It should be really, really easy.
Now, you could say, oh, the problem with the bathroom door, that's trivial. The problem with the chair, that's trivial. That doesn't matter. And that might be true. But if it didn't matter, then why would you be thinking about it? Why would you be writing it in your book, in your memoir? Why would that even come up? I could totally believe not caring if the bathroom door got stuck on the airplane and just not thinking about it. But if you didn't care about it and you didn't think about it, you wouldn't write about it in your memoir. Obviously, she does care about it, and obviously she didn't fix it. And I think that's bad. The points about airplane maintenance may seem trivial, but I think agency is a problem for Harris all the way throughout the book. It's at the core of a lot of things that I've been talking about. For example, Harris doesn't go on the Joe Rogan podcast. She says she wanted to go on, but they couldn't make it work. That's low agency. Rogan offered you 3 different dates, and you said no. Well, can you rearrange your schedule? Could you demand a different date? Could you call out Rogan in public and say, I need to go on October 30th, but Rogan doesn't want me on? Could you do something in order to get yourself on the Joe Rogan podcast? It seems to me like she doesn't really try. She offers these 3 dates, the dates don't work out, and that's it. It's very reactive. It's low agency, not making something happen. Or if you can't go on Rogan or you don't want to because you think that would be a hostile interview, and it might be, then could you do something instead? Rogan's audience is mainly younger men who you need to appeal to, who you are losing. So maybe you could go on other big podcasts with audiences of mainly men, mainly young men. For example, I saw Donald Trump on the Theo Von podcast and on the All In podcast, and I'm sure many other podcasts. Did Harris do anything like that where she's trying to appeal to big demographics that she's losing? Or where she's trying to make up for the fact that she's not doing Joe Rogan? I didn't see her do anything like that. Low agency is pervasive across this entire book. For example, there's a part where Harris says that the White House press office never publicized her accomplishments, which left the American public feeling like Harris had no accomplishments. And I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm not saying it's not a problem. What I am saying is that, Madam Vice President, it's your responsibility to fix that problem. It's low agency to say, oh, a bad thing happened to me. The high agency thing is to say, how do I fix this bad thing? How do I solve it and succeed despite it? So if I was the vice president and the press secretary isn't publicizing my accomplishments, I would first sit down with the press secretary and say, hey, I expect you to publicize my accomplishments. Why aren't you? And I would be interested to know what the answer to that is. Why weren't they publicizing your accomplishments? What did they say? Did they have a different opinion? Did they say, it's not my job to publicize the vice president's accomplishments? Well, if that's what happened, then I'd go to Biden and I'd say, hey, your press secretary isn't publicizing my accomplishments. Here's why I think they should do that. And if Biden wasn't on board, I'd figure out how I could convince Biden. I think this is really important. It's important for my political career. It's important for the country. It's important in case you can't continue onto the second term. You are 81 years old after all. I'd make that case why it's important for his press secretary to publicize my accomplishments. And I'd ask, what can I do to get your press secretary to do that? And if that didn't work, I would also try to publicize my own accomplishments. I'm the vice president. I could go on TV whenever I want. I could be constantly talking about all my many great accomplishments too. I have friends who have large media platforms. I could have them talk about my accomplishments. I would not just accept that someone else isn't doing something I want them to do. The end. Like, that's a terrible low agency spot to leave it in. And it's troubling that seemingly that is what she did. She doesn't talk about any of the stuff I mentioned. She doesn't explain anything how she tried to solve the problem of the White House not publicizing her accomplishments. She just leaves it at, they didn't. The end. That's a problem. Why? Why doesn't she explore that or explain that or figure out what the problem is or try an alternate route to solve it? The whole thing with Biden dropping out, I think that's low agency too. She doesn't prepare for Biden to drop out. And also, I think the biggest thing Harris should have done is challenge Biden in the primary. I don't think she should have gone along as his vice president because, in my opinion, from what I can tell, Biden was just too old to continue to be president. And I think a lot of the country felt that way as well.
Harris herself even knows that Biden was too old to run again. Reading from the book, there was a distinction between his, meaning Biden's, ability to campaign and his ability to govern. I was right beside him as he navigated successfully through intensely dangerous world events. Putin's threat to use tactical nuclear weapons on the Ukraine battlefront, the missile exchanges between Iran and Israel that might have escalated into regional war if we hadn't rallied the diverse coalition that protected Israel during those attacks. His judgment, his experience, and the relationships he had developed were expertly deployed. As for campaigning, I did have concerns. His voice was no longer strong, his verbal stumbles more frequent. Apart from the superhuman stamina required, communicating is the main game. Before he stepped aside from the top of the ticket, I had planned to do many of the big public rallies and a lot of the crazy travel while his team fashioned a White House-based campaign for him. Even so, his inner circle, the people who knew him best, should have realized that any campaign was a bridge too far, and that in its rigors he'd be perpetually, increasingly, unavoidably exhausted. They should have counseled him accordingly. Instead, it seemed that the worse things got, the more they pushed him. And the more they pushed, the faster and more visibly his energy seemed to drain. I had never, in 3.5 years at the White House, in the Oval Office, or the Situation Room, witnessed anything remotely like the level of confusion, incoherence, and debility we saw on the debate stage between Biden and Trump. In this passage, there are familiar themes that occur throughout the entire book. It's someone else's fault. Harris knew that Biden shouldn't have done this. She had concerns about Biden's ability to campaign, but someone else should have solved those concerns. Biden's inner circle, I guess the VP isn't part of his inner circle, but the unnamed inner circle of Biden, they should have solved the concerns that Harris had. So Harris knew about the problem, she didn't solve the problem, and it's someone else's fault. If you know the president is too old to campaign, you're talking about fashioning a White House-based campaign for the president. You know the president is too old to campaign, and you believe that the campaign is an existential danger to the country. Trump is a racist, fascist, sexist who might win, and Biden is too old to campaign. Like, these are not hard dots to connect. Maybe you should tell the public that Biden is too old to campaign. Finally, I just think it's convenient. One of the rare times the public actually sees Biden unscripted, off teleprompter, on camera in the debate stage. That's just, that's coincidentally the worst moment Biden ever had. In 3.5 years, Harris had never seen Biden look anything like that. Biden was never that confused when the cameras were off of him. Just the one rare time he happens to be on camera is his most confused, incoherent, debilitated time. That's quite a coincidence.
And so Harris being close to Biden and being in a position where she could basically end his presidency by saying to the public, Biden is too old to run again, I'm primarying him. Harris had that opportunity. She did not do it. She did not even consider it. That's low agency. That's being reactive. It's waiting for something to happen. Oh, Biden drops out, I guess I'll run. She's waiting for something to happen and she reacts to it, as opposed to the high agency path of making something happen, of challenging Biden in the primary to force the outcome that she wants.
At one point, Harris is complaining about being given problems that are too hard to solve as vice president. I shouldered the blame for the porous border, an issue that had proved intractable for Democratic and Republican administrations alike. No one around the president advocated, give her something she can win with. But, Madam Vice President, you are around the president. You could have advocated to Biden, give me something I could win with. Again, this is low agency. It's other people's fault. No one else is doing it. Did she try to make someone else do it? Did she try to convince Biden to give her something she could win with? What did Biden say? It's again the same issue of something bad happens to her. She's not given tasks she can win with, and she doesn't do anything about it. She just accepts the losing position. Similar thing. When Republicans mischaracterized my role as border czar, no one in the White House comms team helped me to effectively push back and explain what I had really been tasked to do, nor to highlight any of the progress I had achieved. I won commitments of $5.2 billion in new investments by private companies for the region in South and Central America where she's trying to get investment. I had already seen almost $1 billion of that money deployed, thanks to enthusiastic partners such as MasterCard, Microsoft, and Nespresso. I held numerous bilateral meetings with leaders throughout the region, especially with President Alejandro Giammattei in Guatemala, and later his successor, President Bernardo Arevalo. I had multiple calls with Giammattei, warning him that I expected free and fair elections, sending my national security advisor, Phil Gordon, to reinforce the message in person, and publicly supporting Arevalo once the election was called. I worked closely with Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and later his successor, President Claudia Sheinbaum, on our mutual border concerns. The investment I was bringing was a bargaining chip with regional governments to crack down on corrosive levels of corruption. These American companies, I told them, would not invest unless real steps were taken. So which is it? Is she handling corruption or immigration? I don't know. The investments I encouraged have connected communities to the internet, brought people into the formal financial system, creating jobs and opportunity. In the locations where I was able to bring new enterprises and greater stability, data showed it was working. Our investments had created 70,000 new jobs, reached over 1 million people with training programs, and connected 2.5 million unbanked people with banking services and access to credit. These people were staying put. I wanted to get the news out, but White House staff stalled. Not yet. We need more data. The story remained untold. And just to be clear, since it may not be clear, since I'm just jumping into this part of the book, she's specifically talking about her work investing money in countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So she's not talking about creating jobs for American citizens. She's talking about investing money to create jobs for citizens of those countries. Her logic is if we can invest in those countries and develop them, fewer immigrants from those countries will come to the United States.
Now, I would also put this in the low agency bucket because the problem that people had was illegal immigration in the United States. And you didn't solve that. You didn't fix it. You worked on something else, investing money in South America, which might have solved the problem conceptually. Maybe South American countries will become so great with investment that nobody will want to leave. That might have worked, but it didn't work. It didn't solve the problem that American voters actually had. And so you didn't get any credit for it. You don't get credit for trying hard or for doing something that may be good on its own, but just didn't help the problem that people actually had. So when the American voters are upset that Harris was put in charge of the border or something, whatever that really means, what the American voters wanted was less illegal immigration. And what Harris did was invest money in South America, which did not curtail the illegal immigration issue. So I don't know what, and Harris is complaining that the White House didn't publicize her efforts, but her efforts didn't solve the problem. It's low agency. The high agency thing would be to say, how do I solve the problem? The high agency thing is you meet with the White House press secretary and you say, why aren't you publicizing me? And she says, because you didn't solve the problem. And then you go, I have to shut down illegal immigration somehow. Then they'll publicize my accomplishments. That would be the high agency figure out a solution method. But what Harris chooses to do is I didn't solve the problem. Why aren't they publicizing my accomplishments? And that's low agency. She doesn't solve the problem. She doesn't even solve her own problem of getting her accomplishments publicized. Another thing I think of as low agency is focusing on the inputs rather than the outputs. So when Harris is talking about her work on illegal immigration, she's talking about the meeting she had. She met with this leader and that leader, and they talked about it. But meetings are inputs. Meetings are required to make stuff happen, but they aren't the thing you want to happen. Meetings are like the work, or it's like spending. If you talk to a construction crew who's building your house and you want to know about progress, you don't want to hear them say, "We spent a lot of money." I mean, you might have to spend money to build the house. You want them to say, "We've installed the plumbing, we've done the electrical, we built the first floor," something like that. "We're working on the roof." You want them to say what they're doing. You want them to talk about the outputs. And analogously, when Harris is talking about illegal immigration, she talks about all the people she's meeting with, all the money she's spending, all the conference calls she's having, and so on. But she's not talking about the outputs, what actually happened. As far as I can tell, the countries that Harris was investing money in, their immigration to the United States actually increased during Harris's term.
In the book, Harris tells us that she did. Remember, from March 2021, her assignment was to attack the root causes of the misery that was driving people from their homes and villages in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So March 2021, she starts. And she says that in the locations where I was able to bring new enterprises and greater stability, data showed it was working. They created new jobs, they invested new money, data showed it was working, and people were staying put. I'm not so sure about that. For example, this document from congress.gov is showing us trends in immigration from the Northern Triangle countries. That's the same three countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the important plot is this one. This is encounters at the southwest border from people with citizenship in these countries. So encounters between people with these citizenships, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Border Patrol. You can see in 2021, there is a big spike. We're around 300,000 for Guatemala and Honduras, around 100,000 for people in El Salvador. And then you can see that the spike starts to recede. So if you're Kamala Harris, maybe you say, the spike receding. That's my hard work investing money in these countries to convince fewer immigrants to come. But you can also see that there's this long run trend from 2011 to 2018 where encounters with people from those countries are below 100,000. So to me, it seems more like there's a big spike, probably COVID related, causing immigration encounters in 21. And then the numbers start to move back towards their long-running average. So I just don't know how much credit we can give Harris for that. These numbers are all elevated relative to their long-term average. And then if we look at a different website, which gives us more up-to-date data, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol data, here they're grouping the data in a slightly different way. This is, again, encounters at the southern border with people from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And the groupings, the lines are different fiscal years. So the blue line is fiscal year 2023. Notice encounters actually go up at the southern border with people from these countries in the year 2023. So it increases especially towards the end of the fiscal year. And then in fiscal year 2024, the orange line, encounters do go down from the high in the end of 2023. But this might be because, if we were cynical, we might say Biden and Harris realized that immigration was an election issue, and so they started enforcing the border more strictly or more harshly, and they reduced encounters that way. And then the red line is fiscal year 2025, and you see it basically falls to zero in February of 2025. So I would say this isn't really consistent with Harris having a big effect on southwest border encounters with people from these three countries. It is consistent with Trump having a huge effect.
So even this accomplishment that the White House didn't talk about, I'm not even sure the accomplishment actually happened. Yes, she had meetings about it, and yes, she spent money and invested money in South American countries, but did she reduce immigration from those countries? I don't think so. Chapter 10. We've finally reached the final chapter. I hope you're as excited as I am. This chapter is about Israel and Palestine. My thinking on Israel and Palestine crystallized when I saw this letter from the U.S. Secretary of State and Defense under Joe Biden. And basically, the letter is addressed to Israel. And it says, you're not letting in enough food and medical supplies. You're letting in far less than is needed. You must let in more. You have 60 days or some number of days. And Israel ignored that letter. And I say that this crystallized the situation for me because I hear a lot on social media, I see a lot on the news. I don't know exactly what to believe about the situation in Israel and Palestine. But when I see that decision makers who have information, who are in positions of authority in the United States, like the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, their assessment seems to be, actually, yeah, Israel isn't letting in enough food or medical supplies. To me, I feel like that's the best interpretation. It's at least the best data or the best source that I feel like I came across. So if our government is saying, Israel, people there are starving, you need to let in more food and medical supplies, and they don't, that seems like a big problem for me. When Harris talks about this in the book, she's always careful to simultaneously say there are problems in Gaza and she's concerned about Israel's security. For example, quote, this reminds me of an old Norm Macdonald joke where he says he's terrified that Islamic terrorists will detonate a nuclear bomb in the United States and kill 50 million people because imagine the backlash against peaceful Muslims. And it's a funny joke because he's concerned about the wrong party, or he seems to be concerned about the wrong party. That would be really terrible because the nuclear bomb killed Americans, you know? Well, I feel like it's a similar thing here. Kamala Harris is talking about families eating animal food and starving children and people being shot at a food truck. And Israel's security is what she's concerned with. I'm sorry, did you say people were starving? Did you say they're shooting families at food trucks? It seems like there's a big disconnect. Harris is simultaneously validating the criticism that people have of Israel. They're doing these horrible things to the people of Gaza, and she's not doing anything about it. It's like if I ran up to a policeman and I said, help me, this guy's beating me up. And the policeman said, yes, that guy is a criminal. What he's doing to you is terrible. He's committing a crime. And then just stood there. I'd say, so help me, arrest him. What are you doing? I'm not just telling you that for fun. It's the same thing with Harris. She says, look, these bad things are happening in Gaza. It's horrible. The end. That's it. So what are you going to do about it? If you're elected president, what are you going to do that's different from Biden? Actually, you're vice president right now. What are you doing right now to address this thing that you acknowledge is horrible? Harris doesn't have a good answer. I didn't hear her give a good answer in the campaign. There's not a good answer in the book. She doesn't really analyze it or discuss this tension, which I think hurt her. It hurt her among progressive voters, among Arab and Muslim voters, especially in Michigan. She's losing votes. And I think it kind of ties into a number of the criticisms that I've talked about in other chapters. It's low agency. She's not making a decision and acting on it. She's not doing anything more than just talking about this sometimes at campaign rallies. It's not looking at data or the polls. If she had been focused on numbers, which she kind of dismisses, she might have noticed that her stance was actually hurting her. And it's just completely not reflective. Rather than analyzing the strategic decisions and trade-offs that she made, she just kind of tells us that this happened. I gave this strong speech talking about the horrible things in Gaza, and I reaffirmed my commitment for Israel's security. Okay, why? Why did you do those two things? Doesn't that create this tension I've been talking about? How do you address that? Do you recognize that what you did was a problem or that it wasn't good? And what could you have done better? There's just nothing like that in the book, and I found it frustrating. I hope that's come across in the review. Conclusion. Finally, we've reached the end of this terrific video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. That's a lot. I'd like to say first, thank you and sorry. Thank you to Julio and Samuel, who both contributed money. Originally, I said I would review this book if someone donated $15 to me, the cost of buying the book on Kindle. And two people, Julio and Samuel, did. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you both. And also to both of you, sorry that it took so long. I originally thought it would take 1 to 2 weeks, but it wound up taking me, I think, 3 months. So that's not good. Now, partially it took me so long because I was hospitalized for 5 days in the middle of it. And then when I got out of the hospital, I just didn't feel like doing much. But mostly it took me so long because I found it hard to just get started doing the video. I originally wrote my review as an article that I posted on Twitter, and I always intended to then record from that article as a script. But every time I started to record from the text of the article, which again, you can read on my Twitter, I think it's very interesting. It felt like that was the wrong method or the wrong media to use as the script. Mainly, it just took so long because I didn't want to do it. I felt like a text-to-speech generator if I was just reading the script. And then as I was reading the script, there are a lot of quotes in the article. I didn't use that many quotes in the video, I think, but there are a lot of quotes in the article. So I'd be reading the script and I'd just be thinking, oh, I'm gonna have to edit in all these quotes and do something for that. I don't know. It just seemed like I wasn't enjoying recording the video, and so then I'd stop and restart days later, just put it off. So anyway, basically what I'm saying is, sorry about that. I accepted your generous contributions, Julio and Samuel, and then I just didn't do anything for months. If you want your money back, feel free to DM me and I'll send it back to you, because I was not a good, I don't know, counterparty in this interaction. Again, sorry about that. All right, that ends the section where I address Julio and Samuel. Thank you again, both. I appreciate it. Other things I'll say in the conclusion. Even though I struggled to film this at first, I hope the method of filming it, of presenting, that I've settled on and did in this entire video, where I'm not reading from a script, I'm just kind of talking or sometimes yelling at my camera while I look at it. I wrote the script first, and now I'm saying the ideas as I remember them into the camera. I hope that method is good. I hope you enjoyed it. You've watched this far. I know you did. Remember to like and subscribe. You must have enjoyed it if you've watched this long. Anyway, so I hope that's a good method. And assuming it is a good method, it's also a method that I enjoy. So my goal for 2026 is to publish at least 12 of these videos. I probably shouldn't say that goal out loud in case someone tries to hold me to it, but that is my goal. Think of it as my pre-New Year's resolution, to publish one a month or something like that. So if you enjoyed this, again, you've watched it for an hour. I know you must have enjoyed it. I assume this video is an hour long. I have no idea. I haven't edited yet. But anyway, you've watched this long. Follow along and I'll post more videos like this over the next year. And of course, I post a video roughly every day on TikTok if you're not subscribed to that channel. So I was about to say thanks for your time, but I actually have a few more things to get to in the conclusion. Let's talk about the book itself, the conclusion. Basically, did I like the book? That should probably be part of a book review, right? Well, typically I rate books on a scale of 1 to 3. 1, didn't finish reading. 2, finished it. 3, I loved it. And for me, I'd say this book is a 2. I did finish reading it. I would have finished reading it even if I wasn't doing it for this review. I think the writing is pretty good. It's nothing special, but it's very easy to read. The story isn't too complicated. It's, mostly linear, just laid out interesting stuff that happened. I followed the election. I like politics, so I was interested in the topic. And it's nice to hear from, Harris herself, who's actually there. I had a lot of complaints of the book, as I talked about in this review. I don't feel like Harris is very analytical. She doesn't consider alternatives. She's not very strategic. Things like that is what kept the book from being a 3 for me. So would I recommend this book? No, probably not. Not unless I can find an Amazon affiliate link and get it in here so I could get a percentage of every book you buy. Then I'd recommend you bought 10 copies. Give it to all your friends. But no, seriously, would I recommend this book? No, not unless you're a huge Kamala Harris fan, in which case, I guess, read it, sure. Or unless, like me, you followed the campaign with a lot of interest and you're interested in politics and so on, and you have literally nothing else to read, then I'd say, hey, you could read this, I guess. But generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend the book. There's just not too much interesting, and there's a lot of kind of frustrating moments where there could be something interesting and Harris avoids it. She talks about how she worked on getting investment for countries in South and Central America to try to make those countries better places to live so that they would not be sending large numbers of immigrants to the United States. And that is an interesting idea. It's an interesting approach to the issue. But I wonder how well it worked or what that money wound up getting used for. I'm just curious to learn more about what happened there and what Harris did, what her role in that was, how successful her efforts were. So I hope to read more about that in the future. Okay, I think that covers it from me about this book. I'd love to know what you think about Harris or about my book review. Am I missing anything or do you disagree with me? I'd love to know. Leave me a comment. And yeah, thanks for your time.